The challenge of being the last panel is lots of people said really smart things, and I kept on checking off the things I planned to say before I got here, and they were said by other people. So what I'm going to do instead is try to think a little bit about what did we learn, or what can we use to build on, and also be the political science professor who has to make some corrections to the students. My bias in this is I'm not a deterrence guy. I'm an alliance guy these days and a civ mil guy. So I'm going to mostly I'll end up talking a lot about domestic politics, which we really haven't talked a whole lot about and how it affects deterrence. But first, on to the basics. When I would teach deterrence in my intro to IR class, I would start with the movie Footloose, because there's a great illustration of a chicken game in the famous tractor scene. Do not watch the remake, because there is no tractor scene in the remake. And in that, you have two young men who are trying to impress their lady friend, their mutually desirable lady friend, or mutually desired lady friend, and they engage in a test of wills. And every time I would talk to my students, I would see something different in the video that would help to explain deterrence. Because, for instance, this battle between the two matters because there are audiences watching them, so they have to both prove their credibility to resolve. And then Kevin Bacon, the star, gets his shoelace tied to the detractor. The problem in that is not so much that his shoelace is tied, so he can't swerve. It's that he doesn't communicate to the other side that he is irrevocably tied to his course of action. The other guy pointed out to my class, I say, he was smoking pot. And the students are like, yeah, that was wrong. I'm like, no, that's not wrong. Again, it's Canada. The problem is that he doesn't tell the other guy that he's on pot, so therefore he doesn't communicate the fact that he's not making quick decisions. Of course, the big question at the end of the day is, why are they playing chicken at all? Isn't this a game you can avoid? And I guess that was what we decided yesterday in Singapore, was we're not going to be playing nuclear deterrence anymore between the North Koreans and the Americans. It's all over with. Great. But I do want to correct one miscalculation that many people in this room made over the course of the past couple of days. They have been saying deterrence equals capability, whether it's to the exponent of L or not, times resolve plus other things. No, 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 no. Deterrence is not inequality. It's an inequality. Whether deterrence is greater than or less than the other courses of action. So in 1941, Japan faced a deterrent threat. There's a big fleet at Pearl Harbor. If we do something bad, it's going to come out after us. However, we cannot sustain the current status quo. It is unsustainable to us. Things are going to be bad, so it's better to attack now rather than later. And so they faced a deterrent threat. They weighed it as being credible. They weighed it as being real and significant, and they said, nope, the present sucks and it's going to get worse. So when we think about deterrent threats, we can't just think about what we are doing, but what we are doing relative to the status quo and how things are shifting towards the future, because countries might like to act earlier rather than when things get to be worse for themselves. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that deterrence is simply the prevention of stuff via threats. It is not compellence. We had some people confuse deterrence and compellence. Compellence is making people do things, or else we'll do things to them, or we'll keep on doing things to them. Like, for instance, Kosovo, Serbia and Kosovo. We were bombing Kosovo until the Serbs let us in. That was a compellant threat. And everything that we know about deterrence versus compellence is that it's much harder to get somebody to change their behavior than to keep on doing things. It's much easier to keep North Korea from attacking South Korea than it is to get North Korea, for instance, to get rid of its nuclear weapons. So we need to be sensitive to that. We need to be sensitive that deterrence is only one strategy that's available to us, that there are other alternatives. We can go on the offense and attack. We can simply be on the defense and say, okay, we face this threat. We're just going to resist it and hopefully stop it at our frontier. We could reduce our vulnerability by improving our cyber network, so therefore whatever hacking does minimal damage. Or we can build resilience, so that way whatever is done to us, we can go, okay, that was bad, but we can move on. I mean, the way the stereotypical thing is the way the British react to terrorism versus the way the Americans react to terrorism. Stiff upper lip and all that stuff. But when we think about, for instance, the difference between the American election and the French election was the Russians tried to play both elections. In the United States, you had actors who might be called the President of the United States who abetted the Russians in their gaming of the election. And they were supported by the Republican Party. Remember, Mitch McConnell was asked by Obama, hey, let's take a position against this hacking and confront it. And Mitch McConnell said, no, we really want to have Supreme Court seats and tax cuts. Whereas in France, you had hacking happened. You had, and the French had all this stuff dumped onto them in the last days of the election. And two things were different. One is the French have restrictions on their press, so they couldn't really do much media on it in the last couple days of the election, because you're not supposed to do a lot of media coverage in the last couple days of election. And second, most of the parties in France, in the end, lined up with Macron, even though Macron was not really their cup of tea, because Le Pen was much less their cup of tea. And they might have also been thinking, we really don't want to give the Russians what they want. So that's important. We need to think about, there are other policies besides deterrence. Despite the fact that's the theme here, we need to think about the alternatives. Third, as somebody said today, we don't really know when deterrence works. Because if somebody doesn't do something, it doesn't mean that it was because we threatened them. It could be they had no interest in conquering West Germany, or they had no interest in invading South Korea, or they had no interest in all the other things that we deter. Here's the tricky thing. We also often don't know whether deterrence has failed either. There was a huge literature, huge debate in the 1980s that had all kinds of ologies, epistemologies, ontologies, and all the rest of it attached to the scholarly question of, does deterrence fail? Do we know when deterrence has failed? Because we don't really know if we've done all the things that requires deterrence to work, which is, did we have the capability? Did we have a resolve? Did we signal resolve? Was the situation one in which there wasn't a more attractive status quo out there? We often don't know when war breaks out whether it was a failure of deterrence or there was something else going on. So we can't always go throughout history and go, okay, deterrence failure, deterrence success, whatever. Maybe you can't say the deterrence successes because you can't see them because nothing happened. But even the obvious failures may not be so obvious. Now, getting on to what people started talking about, I guess my starting question for all of this stuff is, we live in the age of Trump, and the phrase I've used to describe Trump is he's an uncertainty engine. He creates uncertainty about everything. For instance, he said in the aftermath of the summit, well, I might be wrong in several months, and I won't admit it, I'll make up some kind of excuse. It's like, okay, that was actually the most certain and clear and credible thing you've said in quite some time. But what does that do to deterrence? What does that do to our threats? In some ways it matters a whole lot. In some ways it may not matter at all. I hinted in one of my questions the other day, yesterday, that if the Estonians are going to fire upon any Russians across the border, and the Canadians who stand next to them will probably do so as well, while the Italians and the Spaniards call home for instructions, that's probably enough to create enough uncertainty in Putin's mind that this thing might get out of control. Again, this is a threat that leads something to chance. So if the threat that leaves something to chance is still operative, even with Trump in the room, then maybe most of our deterrent threats are okay. And maybe we don't have to worry too much. So that's something to think about. On the other hand, Jacek mentioned yesterday the alliance dilemma, that in any alliance you have to worry about two things, whether the ally abandons you or the ally entraps you in a war. Usually you only have to worry about one of those at a time. The gift of Donald Trump is you worry about both simultaneously. And so we've seen that and how that affected Moon in Korea, which is he panicked and desperately tried to find a deal to avert being entrapped in an American war. And meanwhile, the Abe, the Japanese prime minister, is worried about being abandoned. So same situation, having very different consequences for the two alliance partners. Although, of course, the Japanese were also very worried about a war they didn't want to fight. Phil Williams, who just left, raised a question yesterday, which is about the stability and stability paradox. That is, if you are deterred at the strategic level, does that free you up to do things at the lower levels? And we see this we've seen this in the past. Chris Fair was talking about Pakistan. Pakistan can all this terrorism stuff because they know that India can't retaliate because it'll spiral up to nuclear war. So the Pakistanis are freed to do all this nasty stuff at lower levels. Similarly, we see Putin doing all kinds of things that are awful, 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 but they're not likely to trigger this process that leads to nuclear war. And so I've been wondering if the stability and stability paradox favors authoritarian regimes because they can gamble more. Because if they get their own citizens hurt, that's okay. Whereas democratic leaders are very reluctant to play this game because they're very worried about getting sucked into a war. They're very also worried about making threats that they can't back up. And so then the question becomes, does Trump's authoritarian tendencies, or is at least as willing to gamble, make him better able to confront our adversaries because he can play the instability paradox game as well. He can make, I mean, we had that all in the past year with North Korea, right? That it seemed like we were escalating, and he didn't seem to mind escalate. And people were talking about, well, you know, it might be bad for South Korea, but they'll probably miss Seattle. Okay, punch them in the nose. I mean, that whole discussion could be looked at in that light. There's been a lot of talk about NATO and deterrence and reassurance, and the question I have today is, I've mentioned the threat that leaves something to chance, but there's something else going on with NATO which makes NATO special and different. NATO is not any alliance. It is the alliance. It has changed how we think about alliances, because it used to be alliances formed before war. Maybe it stayed together during the war, and then would be over at the end of the war. This has now been in place for 70 years and is deeply institutionalized. And it has worked because it has not only a common purpose, or at least it did have a common purpose, which was thwarting the Soviet Union, but shared values. It is the democratic alliance that when all the countries in Eastern Europe wanted to join, they had to sign on all kinds of documents to prove that they were real democracies, had real civilian control of the military, yada, 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 and whether they really met those conditions or not, at least that exercise was important. And we used to be able to handle one or two autocracies in NATO at a time. Okay, it's the Greeks. Who cares? They never really show up anyway. Maybe it's the Turks. Again, how much do we need them? But when you have a critical mass of autocracies in the alliance, which is Hungary, which, again, who cares? They never show up. Greece, not right now, but soon maybe. Turkey, definitely. I used Poland, but my Polish friends here push back. And then there's the United States, with whatever it's going through right now could lead to greater autocracy in the United States. And then suddenly you have a critical mass of countries that are not sharing the same values. There is another trend within the alliance, which is growing xenophobia. So I missed the panel on the southern flank, but I think a large part of the concern about the southern flank of NATO is driven by fear of immigrants. That's causing division within the alliance. It's certainly causing Britain dividing from the rest of Europe, so Brexit is partly that dynamic. And there's even growing isolationism. You know, people used to accuse Obama of being an isolationist. How quaint. Trump, America first. When I first started hearing that American first slogan, I was like, who told him that? And they know what the legacy of America first is? But Trump is talking about getting out of Korea. This is part of a larger pattern. There's not many consistencies to what Donald Trump says, but America first means something. There's something real to it. Brexit has a lot of the same fingerprints, not just Russian, but same kind of fingerprints of xenophobia and isolationism. They're built into it. How do you have an alliance with isolationist countries, particularly the ones who have been known to be the burden bearers? That's a problem for future deterrence and for future reassurance. I'll just speak a little bit about domestic politics, because we haven't talked a whole lot about it, which is one of the things that's going on now, which is going to make all the stuff much harder, is you're to have politicians competing with each other to be distant from Trump. It was hard to get countries to do more in Afghanistan when George Bush was president in the aftermath of 2003. It was easier to get them to kick in when Obama was president, because guess what? In those democracies, when Bush was president, those populists did not like George Bush, and so therefore if you buddied up to Bush, that was bad. So whatever Chirac did for the United States, he did in secret, and whatever was public was not very close to the United States. Suddenly you have Obama be president, and suddenly countries are kicking in more into Afghanistan, they're reducing their caveats, all the rest. We see this today in Canada, where now, usually, we never talk about bipartisanship in Canada, and we never talk about tripartisanship in Canada, because it's a very oppositional system, and it's your duty to oppose. But now we see all three parties lined up supporting the Prime Minister because Canada is now a victim to Donald Trump's temper. It's causing even me, who's a very public dairy cartel skeptic, to be tolerant of the continuation of supply management for the time being, because I don't want to suck up to Donald Trump. But it's not just a European thing, it's also an Asian thing. How do we get South Korea and Japan to cooperate? As much as things are hard with 28 or 29 countries. It's much harder with 3 when 2 hate each other. When I was in Korea last month, I was interviewing people about other stuff, but I would hear people list off things. Well, our adversary, have to do our plans for our adversaries or whatever, and they'd be like, there's North Korea, there's China, there's Japan. I'm like, well, what? And then we talk about, somebody would be talking about how they need to come up with new allies to diversify from just being independent of the United States. And they'd go, well, Indonesia, India. I'm like, Japan? No. So it's all very, very hard. So there's that. The last thing I'll say is I really liked Elaine's talk about tailoring, because it was a really good metaphor, but it's also really, really applicable to all that's going on here, which is how do you tailor your message? And her point about you can't really tailor your message too carefully in a globalized world. Okay, the United States says exercise. War games are expensive, and we're going to get out of that business. That means something to the Baltics. It means something to Europe, and it's not just a Korean thing. So the fact that European countries have often been very hostile to American exercises or NATO exercises because they mess up the roads and they're inconvenient and all the rest of it, they cause traffic, all the rest now gets even more credence now that the President of the United States considers them to be expensive and unnecessary. On the other hand, I do think you can tailor capabilities. Think about it. We've got 4,000 troops standing off the Russian army. And we got 28,000 troops standing off the North Korean army. So we have different levels of commitment, arrayed in different kinds of ways. One's very multinational, and the multinational, as John Denny suggested yesterday, is very, very important. Multinational is not the way you would describe the events in East Asia. It's bilateral, bilateral, bilateral all the way through. And so you can have the same play, which is tripwire, but you have to do it differently. And so you can do that. So I think you can tailor your capabilities, but you can't really tailor your messaging. So I think that's an important distinction. Finally, since I've already run too long, and somebody has to catch a flight, there are limits to what nuclear weapons can do. They can never reassure your allies enough, because allies can never be assured enough. On the other hand, it doesn't take that much to deter. You don't need to have, 15,000 nuclear weapons at one point in time to deter somebody. You just have to really make it clear that there's this threat that can lead to things that will lead out of control. So your deterrence calculation might be 1% times infinity, right? That's good enough to deter, because a nuclear war is awful. We may have forgotten that, but it doesn't take that much to deter. And so the reassurance game is harder than the deterrence game, which is okay. It'd be better that way than the other way around. Likewise, our adversaries are all pursuing alternative means than conventional war. So we have insurgencies, we've got cyber war, we've got this, that, the other thing. This is a win. Because however bad cyber war is, however bad insurgencies are, however bad that other is, we haven't seen conventional war in Europe or North America in our lifetimes. So we should be quite happy with the way things have gone thus far, in at least that way. So I guess that makes me an optimist, which is a very strange position to be in these days.